History is not a fixed story, but a puzzle constantly rearranged by new pieces. We have a habit of dismissing ancient accounts as pure fantasy whenever they clash with what we think we know. Yet time and again, the careful work of archaeology has reached back through the centuries to pull myth into the realm of verified history. This journey explores 35 specific ancient manuscripts, from epic poems to merchant guides, once labeled as fiction, but later linked to undeniable physical places. By the end, you will see a compelling pattern that challenges us to reconsider every forgotten story. What hidden truth was buried with a lost Mesopotamian city? And how could a Viking saga correctly describe a coastline it should not have known? These are not just old tales, they are maps waiting to be read. What other grand story from our past do you think is still waiting for its real-world confirmation? One of the oldest stories ever told begins with a king who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a ruler who built magnificent walls and sought the secret of eternal life. For centuries, the Epic of Gilgamesh existed only in fragments, a whispered legend from a forgotten world. When 19th century archaeologists unearthed a library of clay tablets in the ruins of Nineveh, they finally held the complete poem in their hands. But scholars of the time largely dismissed it as a fascinating work of mythology, a fantastical tale featuring a wild man, a great flood sent by angry gods, and a quest for a plant that could grant immortality. It was a compelling story, but surely just a story. The city of Uruk, with its gleaming walls and temple towers described in such detail, was presumed to be as fictional as the hero himself. Yet the text itself provided a map not of geography but of cultural memory. It spoke of kiln-fired bricks and a city so grand it required a walk just to traverse it. Driven by this literary clue, explorers turned their attention to the sands of southern Iraq. There, at a site known as Walker, the earth began to yield its secrets. The lost city of Uruk was not a myth, it was a metropolis. Archaeologists uncovered the massive cyclopean walls Gilgamesh was said to have built. They found the remains of the White Temple, dedicated to the sky god Anu, perched atop a great ziggurat that once dominated the horizon. They even found evidence of the early kings listed in the epic, tracing a line of historical rulership that matched the poetic narrative. The fantastical epic was, in essence, a deeply historical document, preserving the memory of a real place, its achievements, and its anxieties. The discovery was a seismic shift in understanding. It proved that ancient poetry could be a container for profound truth, that descriptions of architecture, society, and even flood legends could be rooted in lived experience. This validation of Uruk forced a fundamental question upon the academic world. If one great poem could be so meticulously accurate about a city, what other so-called myths were simply waiting for their corresponding ruins to be found? The validation of Uruk sent a clear message across the centuries to another legendary text waiting for its own vindication. For generations, the Iliad stood as the pinnacle of Western literature, a sweeping epic of gods and heroes, of a 10-year siege over the most beautiful woman in the world. Academics admired its poetic power but were nearly unanimous in declaring the Trojan War a foundational myth, a beautiful fiction. The city of Troy, with its towering walls and Scaean gates, was considered no more real than Mount Olympus. Into this scholarly consensus stepped a man driven not by academic training, but by a childhood belief in the literal truth of Homer's verses. Heinrich Schliemann, a successful businessman and passionate amateur, decided to use the ancient poem as a field guide. He focused on a tell, a large man-made mound in northwestern Turkey known as Hisarlik. The geographical descriptions in the Iliad, the view from the walls, the distance to the sea, all pointed him there. Ignoring the dismissals of established historians, he began to dig. What he uncovered was nothing short of revolutionary. Hisarlik was not one city, but many, built layer upon layer over millennia. He found evidence of massive defensive walls, of gates that could have been the very ones described in the epic, and of a great burning event that suggested a violent destruction. Schliemann famously declared he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon, though the gold mask he found was from a much earlier era, a misstep born of enthusiasm. Yet the core of his discovery was undeniable. He had found a major Bronze Age citadel exactly where Homer's epic said it should be, a place that had clearly known warfare and conquest. This excavation fundamentally rewrote the map of ancient history. It proved the Aegean world of the late Bronze Age, the world of Mycenaean kings and palatial complexes, was not just a vague backdrop for myth, but a tangible historical period with interconnected cities capable of the kind of large-scale conflict Homer described. The Iliad was transformed from a pure allegory into a poetic memory of a real place and a probable war, its heroes perhaps amalgams of historical figures, its divine interventions a narrative device to explain the chaos of human conflict. Schliemann's work, for all its later criticism regarding methodology, forced the world to ask a new and thrilling question. If Troy was real, what other epic landscapes were still hidden, patiently waiting for someone to read the old stories not as fiction, but as a very specific kind of map? The discovery of Troy shattered a comfortable assumption that ancient texts were either fact or fiction. But what happens when a document considered sacred history itself contains a name that seems to belong only in myth? For centuries, biblical scholars reading the Old Testament encountered a puzzling people, the Hittites. They appeared as a neighboring power, as warriors, even as individuals like Uriah the Hittite in the story of King David. Yet outside the Bible, there was no record of them in any known Egyptian, Assyrian, or Mesopotamian archive. To historians of the 19th century, this was a glaring anachronism, a clear sign that the biblical writers had inserted a legendary, perhaps invented, nation into their historical narratives to lend them weight. The Hittites were dismissed as a biblical myth, a phantom people conjured from the past. This scholarly consensus held until a series of strange monuments began to draw attention in the remote highlands of central Turkey. European travelers reported seeing massive, enigmatic stone carvings near a village called Bogaskale, sculptures of warriors and deities unlike anything from Greece or Mesopotamia. These silent sentinels pointed toward a forgotten capital. Systematic excavations began, and soon the scale of the discovery became undeniable. The ruins of a vast city, Hattusa, emerged from the earth, with cyclopean walls stretching for miles, grand gateways guarded by stone lions and sphinxes, and the remains of immense temples and palaces. This was not a minor settlement, it was the heart of a formidable empire. The real breakthrough, however, came not from the architecture but from the clay. Archaeologists uncovered entire archives, thousands of tablets inscribed in a then unknown cuneiform script. The painstaking work of decipherment, led by scholars like Bedřich Hrozný, revealed the truth. These were the state records of the Hittite Empire. The language was an early Indo-European tongue, and the documents spoke of treaties, laws, and diplomatic correspondence with the great powers of the age. Most stunningly, they named names. They detailed conflicts and peace agreements with Egypt under Pharaoh Ramesses II, and with the Assyrian Empire to the east. In an instant, the biblical anachronism was transformed into historical fact. The Hittites were not a myth, they were a rival superpower to Egypt, a sprawling Anatolian empire that had been completely erased from common memory for over 3,000 years. Their capital, Hattusa, stood as a monumental testament to a lost chapter of human civilization. This revelation did more than just confirm a biblical reference. It fundamentally altered the geopolitical map of the ancient Near East. It showed that the world of the Old Testament was not an isolated bubble, but a complex international stage where kingdoms like Israel and Judah were minor players navigating between colossal empires. The Phantom had become a pillar of history, proving once again that an absence of evidence in one era is not evidence of absence across time. Across the world, another ancient poem held a detailed portrait of a city that shimmered like a mirage. The Silappatikaram, a masterpiece of classical Tamil literature composed around 2,000 years ago, unfolds a tragic and beautiful tale of love, justice, and divine fate. Within its verses, it paints an extraordinarily vivid picture of the great port city of Puhar, also known as Puhar, describing it as a cosmopolitan hub where merchants from distant lands mingled, where warehouses overflowed with exotic goods, and where the streets echoed with a dozen languages. For a very long time, Western scholars and even many Indian academics viewed this description as poetic license, a romanticized ideal of a golden age that never quite existed in such splendor. The bustling, wealthy port of Puhar was considered a literary device, a symbolic setting for the epic's drama rather than a real place one could ever hope to walk through. The coastline of Tamil Nadu offered no obvious ruins to match the grandeur described in the verses, so the legend remained just that, a beautiful, unverifiable story from a distant past. This perception began to shift not with a shovel in the sand, but with a look beneath the waves. Local fishermen along the coast near present-day Kavarapatinam had long spoken of strange structures visible in the water during low tide, what they called submerged temples. These accounts, once dismissed as folklore, eventually drew the attention of marine archaeologists. What they discovered was a revelation. Systematic underwater surveys revealed the outlines of a vast submerged city, including what appeared to be wharves, stepped bathing ghats, and the foundations of brick structures stretching far out into the sea. These were not natural formations, they were the drowned remains of urban planning. On land, complementary excavations uncovered terracotta artifacts, Roman coins, and pottery from the Mediterranean, providing tangible proof of the long-distance trade networks the epic described. The scale of the submerged ruins indicated a major port city that had been active for centuries before parts of it were claimed by the sea, likely due to coastal erosion or a seismic event. The Silappatikaram was not exaggerating, it was reporting. The epic's meticulous details, from the layout of the merchant quarters to the variety of trade goods, were now seen as a precise cultural snapshot, a documentary in poetic form. This validation did more than just add a pin to the historical map. It restored the voice of an entire literary tradition. It proved that the Sangam literature of ancient Tamilakam was not merely artistic expression but a crucial historical archive, preserving the memory of a sophisticated maritime civilization that thrived on the Indian Ocean's shores. The lost port of Puhar rose from the waves of legend to take its rightful place in history, reminding us that sometimes the most accurate maps are not drawn on parchment, but woven into the very fabric of a people's stories. Sometimes the most reliable witness is the one who perishes in the event they describe. In the year 79, a towering natural disaster unfolded in the Bay of Naples as Mount Vesuvius unleashed its fury upon the surrounding towns. Among those who witnessed the initial stages was a renowned Roman scholar and naval commander, Pliny the Elder. His nephew, Pliny the Younger, later wrote 2 detailed letters to the historian Tacitus, recounting his uncle's scientific curiosity, his doomed rescue mission by sea, and the terrifying progression of the eruption. For centuries, these letters within Pliny's Encyclopedic Naturalis Historia stood as the definitive account. Yet as time passed, and with no other contemporary records to compare them to, later scholars began to pick at the details. The dramatic descriptions of a towering pine tree-shaped cloud, of day turning to night, and of falling pumice and ash were so vivid they seemed almost literary. Some historians quietly wondered if the younger Pliny had embellished the facts to honor his uncle's memory, turning a tragic event into an epic, perhaps slightly fictionalized narrative. The specific sequences and phenomena he described were questioned, relegated to the realm of compelling but potentially unreliable ancient testimony. This skepticism persisted until the buried cities themselves began to speak. The systematic excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum, starting in earnest in the 18th century, provided a frozen moment in time that could be directly compared to the ancient text. The archaeological findings confirmed the account with chilling precision. The stratigraphy of the ash layers matched the eruption phases Pliny described, the initial fall of light pumice followed by the devastating pyroclastic surges. The poses of the victims, captured in plaster casts, told silent stories of sudden, overwhelming heat and ash that aligned perfectly with his descriptions of suffocating darkness and falling debris. Even the specific mention of his uncle's death from toxic fumes near the shore found grim corroboration in the patterns of remains found in similar locations. Modern volcanology provided the final, definitive seal. Scientists gave a name to the specific type of explosive eruption Vesuvius exhibited, classifying it as a Plinian eruption in direct honor of that first meticulous observer. The very phenomena that seemed too dramatic to be true, the towering eruption column and the fast-moving ground surges, were understood as standard characteristics of such a volcanic event. Pliny the Younger was not writing myth, he was providing a flawless, first-hand scientific report. His letters transformed from a potentially suspect historical document into a foundational text of volcanology. This validation underscores a profound truth that ancient observers, even in the midst of terror, were capable of remarkable objective detail. Their accounts are not mere stories, they are data sets waiting for the key to unlock them, proving that sometimes the past speaks its truth in the clearest voice imaginable, if only we know how to listen. The power of an eyewitness account is undeniable, but what about a story passed down for 1,000 years before it was ever written? This is the profound mystery of the Mahabharata, one of the world's longest epic poems. At its heart lies the narrative of a catastrophic war between two branches of a royal family, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, for the throne of the Kuru kingdom. The epic meticulously describes their glorious capital, Hastinapura, a city of grand palaces and wide streets, as the center of a civilization that was torn apart. For a very long time, Western scholars and even many within India viewed this immense text as a magnificent allegory, a spiritual and philosophical treatise wrapped in the guise of a royal saga. The Great War, the detailed genealogies, the city itself, were seen as symbolic, a mythic canvas upon which deeper truths about duty, righteousness, and cosmic order were painted. The historical reality of Hastinapura and the Kuru realm was largely relegated to the realm of collective imagination. This perspective held sway until the ground near a small town in modern Uttar Pradesh, ironically named Hastinapur, began to yield its secrets. Archaeological excavations there uncovered evidence of extensive, continuous habitation. The most compelling finds were associated with what is known as the painted grey ware culture, a distinct archaeological marker characterized by its fine, wheel-made pottery with simple black designs. The time frame of this culture, from roughly 1200 to 600 before the Common Era, aligned strikingly with the traditional dating suggested for the epic's core events. The settlement patterns, the evidence of iron use, and the social organization inferred from the sites painted a picture of a developing political center in the Ganges plain, a place that could indeed have been the seat of a powerful Janapada, or kingdom, like the Kurus described in the Mahabharata. While no inscription has been found naming a specific epic hero, the archaeology did not reveal a mythical city. It revealed a real, thriving urban center from the correct period in the exact geographic location the epic tradition had always claimed. This discovery forced a dramatic reevaluation. The Mahabharata could no longer be seen as pure invention. Instead, it is now widely understood as a monumental act of cultural memory, a poetic synthesis that likely preserved the kernel of a real historical conflict, perhaps a major battle for regional supremacy that was amplified and elaborated over centuries by storytellers. The city of Hastinapura thus bridges two worlds. It is both an archaeological site with tangible layers of pottery and post holes, and a timeless symbol in a nation's consciousness. Its validation suggests that even the grandest, most spiritually charged narratives can have their roots in the very real soil of history, waiting for the careful hand of archaeology to help separate the thread of event from the beautiful tapestry of legend. The search for a city's origins can lead to a symbol that becomes a nation's soul. For the Mexica people, later called the Aztecs, their entire identity was tied to a divine prophecy. Their pictorial histories, known as codices, tell a powerful story of a long migration. Guided by their patron deity Huitzilopochtli, they wandered for generations, carrying his sacred idol, searching for the promised sign. The prophecy was specific and strange. They would know their destined home when they saw an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus, gripping a serpent in its talons. This iconic scene, depicted vividly in documents like the Codex Boturini, was long interpreted by outsiders as pure myth, a poetic origin story crafted to legitimize a powerful empire after the fact. The idea that a great civilization would base its capital on such a fantastical omen seemed like classic myth-making. For centuries, the true location of Tenochtitlan was thought to be lost, buried, and obliterated beneath the sprawling modern capital of Mexico City. The codices were beautiful, but they were not considered maps. That perception began to crumble in the late 1970s during routine utility work in the city's historic center. Workers uncovered an enormous, intricately carved stone disc depicting the dismembered moon goddess Coyolxauhqui. This was no ordinary find. It was a piece of the very heart of the Aztec world. This chance discovery triggered a full-scale archaeological project, unearthing the Templo Mayor, the great temple of Tenochtitlan. Layer by layer, the main ceremonial complex of the Aztec Empire emerged from beneath the city streets. The excavations revealed not just a temple, but the physical proof of the codice's truth. The layout matched descriptions, the offerings found within, from seashells signifying the distant coasts to artifacts from conquered lands, told a story of a people who remembered their journey. Most compellingly, the site itself was exactly what the prophecy described, an island in the middle of a lake. While the lakes have been drained, the geography was confirmed. The symbol of the eagle and the cactus was not a fairy tale. It was a sophisticated geopolitical and spiritual mandate, a divine instruction to build in a specific, strategic location. The codices were transformed from mythic allegory into historical documentation, a visual record of a migration, a covenant, and a city's literal foundation. This discovery did more than verify a story. It restored a voice. It proved that these pictorial manuscripts were a valid form of history, preserving a people's memory with a clarity that words alone could not convey. The Templo Mayor stands today as a bridge between the symbolic and the real, a place where a nation's emblem was first born not on a flag, but in the very stones of its origin. But the quest for a promised homeland is a story told across oceans and ice. Far to the north, in the firelit halls of medieval Iceland, skalds recited epic poems of a different kind of journey. These were the Norse sagas, tales of kings and explorers, written down centuries after the events they describe by scholars like Snorri Sturluson. Within his great work, the Heimskringla, and in sagas like the Saga of the Greenlanders, were passages that seemed to strain credulity. They told of Viking voyages far to the west of Greenland, to a forested coast they called Vinland, a place of wild grapes and mild winters. For generations, these accounts were dismissed by historians as pure legend, the Viking equivalent of tall tales about sea monsters and edge-of-the-world adventures. The idea that Norse sailors had reached the continent of North America some 500 years before Columbus was considered romantic, nationalist fantasy, not credible history. The sagas were gripping literature, but their descriptions of butternuts and timber resources were seen as imaginative details, not geographic coordinates. This scholarly dismissal stood firm until a husband and wife team, Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad, decided to take the old stories at their word. They reasoned that if the Vikings had established a base, it would need a specific kind of location, a sheltered bay with a freshwater source and enough flat land for buildings, close to the open sea for their ships. Following these practical clues from the texts, they searched the coastlines of the North Atlantic. In 1960, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, at a place called Elance Aux Meadows, they found what everyone said could not exist. Local residents pointed them to overgrown mounds that looked unnatural. The excavations that followed revealed the unmistakable footprint of a Norse settlement. Archaeologists uncovered the foundations of 8 turf-walled structures, identical in design to Viking-age buildings found in Iceland and Greenland. They found a bronze ring-headed pin, a stone oil lamp, iron nails, and the definitive proof, a smithy with slag, proving the Norse had worked iron there. This was not a temporary camp. It was a substantial base capable of supporting exploration and ship repair. Every artifact, every building plan screamed Norse origin. The discovery of Elance Aux Meadows was a historical earthquake. It proved beyond any doubt that the Viking sagas were not fiction. They were preserving, in poetic form, the genuine memory of transatlantic exploration. The site itself acted as a key, allowing scholars to reread the saga descriptions with new eyes, identifying likely regions for the richer Vinland described in the tales. This small, windswept settlement transformed our understanding of global exploration, moving the first European contact with the Americas centuries earlier and shifting the credit from Mediterranean navigators to Nordic mariners who dared to sail into the unknown. It stands as a powerful testament that sometimes the most fantastic stories are simply the unvarnished truth, waiting for someone to look in the right place. Yet the journey of the soul is a map every culture seeks to draw. For the ancient Egyptians, this map was not carved in stone but inked on papyrus, a detailed guidebook for the most perilous voyage imaginable. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and incantations, promised safe passage through the terrifying landscape of the underworld, past demonic gatekeepers and lakes of fire, toward a final, peaceful judgment. To early Egyptologists, these vivid, fantastical descriptions were the very essence of religious mythology, a symbolic representation of spiritual beliefs with no basis in physical reality. The jackal-headed god Anubis weighing a heart against a feather, the monstrous Ammit waiting to consume the unworthy, these were seen as powerful metaphors, not references to any tangible practice. The text itself was often treated as a fascinating but purely theological work, a window into a mystical mindset, but not a manual for anything real. This interpretation began to dissolve in the dust of the Theban necropolis, as archaeologists explored the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the burial sites of nobles across the river from modern Luxor. They found the Book of the Dead was not just a story, it was an instruction sheet. The very spells they had read on museum papyri were found painted on tomb walls, written on linen shrouds, and inscribed on the amulets placed within the wrappings of individuals. The descriptions of the burial process, the specific placement of charms, the prayers for breath and movement, were all meticulously enacted in the physical preparations for the journey. The text named real items, real priestly titles, and real ritual actions. The so-called mythical demons and deities were depicted in precise, consistent iconography on the walls of the tombs, serving as guides and guardians for the departed just as the book described. The discovery of nearly intact resting places with their full complement of grave goods and textual accompaniments revealed the truth. The Book of the Dead was a functional piece of funerary technology. It was as practical as a builder's blueprint, providing the necessary words, images, and ritual knowledge to navigate what the culture believed was a literal, treacherous terrain after life. This validation transformed our understanding. It showed that the boundary between myth and manual is often blurred, that a society's most profound spiritual concepts are woven directly into its most concrete practices. The tombs of Thebes are not just silent monuments, they are the enacted version of the sacred text, proving that for the ancient Egyptians, the map of the afterlife was not a metaphor, but a required document for the journey, its reality confirmed by every artifact placed with care in the dark. While the Egyptians charted a spiritual landscape, another culture was mapping the very real contours of commerce and empire with astonishing precision. A document known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea reads like a 1st century shipping manual, written by an anonymous Greek-Egyptian merchant around the middle of the 1st century. It is a dry, practical guide. It lists ports in meticulous order, sailing directions, prevailing winds, and the specific goods available for trade at each stop, from the Red Sea down the East African coast across to Arabia and all the way to India. For modern scholars first encountering it, this very practicality became a point of suspicion. The text described bustling ports in regions like the Horn of Africa and the coast of India with such specific detail that many believed it had to be partly fictional, an idealized trader's wish list or a compilation of sailors' tales rather than a genuine logbook. How could a single merchant have such comprehensive, verified knowledge of such a vast and distant network? The ports of Rapta in Africa or Muziris in India were considered legendary emporiums, names from a trader's fantasy. This skepticism held for generations, consigning the Periplus to the shelf of interesting but unreliable ancient geography. Then, the spades of archaeologists began to turn in the coastal silt from Yemen to Kerala. At a site in southern India, excavations uncovered a veritable time capsule of Roman trade, including massive hoards of Roman coins, Italian wine amphorae, and even a dedicated Roman warehouse structure. This was the lost port of Muziris, exactly where the Periplus said it would be, dealing in exactly the commodities it listed, pepper and gems. Further down the African coast, in places like Somalia and Kenya, researchers identified ancient settlements whose layouts, imported goods, and economic focus aligned perfectly with the Periplus's descriptions of ports like Opon and the mysterious Rapta, known for its ivory and tortoise shell. Even the political entities mentioned, such as the Aksumite kingdom in Ethiopia or the Sabaean kingdom in Yemen, were confirmed as major historical powers through their own inscriptions and ruins. The document's clinical descriptions of monsoon wind patterns, which it insisted were the key to crossing the Indian Ocean, were validated by historical meteorology and the practices of later Arab and Indian sailors. What was once dismissed as a merchant's tall tale was, in fact, one of the most accurate economic geographies ever composed in the ancient world. It was not a work of imagination, but a functional database, a testament to the staggering scale and organization of Indo-Roman trade. Its validation reveals a globalized ancient economy, where a merchant in Alexandria could consult a guidebook and reasonably expect to find a specific type of incense at a specific dock in Arabia, or to exchange Roman glassware for Malabar pepper on the far side of the world. The Periplus does not tell a story of heroes or gods, but of something perhaps more revolutionary, a world connected not by conquest, but by the quiet, relentless pursuit of commerce. While merchants navigated by star and monsoon, a different kind of guide was being recited in the highlands of Guatemala, a story not of trade routes but of cosmic origins. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Q'ich Maya, is a profound narrative that begins in primordial darkness, telling of gods shaping the world from the void, of heroic twins descending into the underworld, and ultimately of the creation of humanity from maize. Woven into this epic of Genesis are very earthly details, the story of the Qumran people themselves and the founding of their magnificent capital, a city referred to in the text as a place of great council and ceremony. For a long time, Western scholars treated the Popol Vuh as a fascinating collection of Maya mythology, a symbolic counterpart to Genesis, but its historical and geographical references were often overlooked or considered allegorical. The capital it described was seen as a mythical city, a spiritual ideal rather than a political reality. This changed when explorers turned their attention to a windswept plateau near the modern town of Santa Cruz del Quiché. There they found the ruins of a city the Spanish had called Tenochtitlan, and which the Qumran themselves knew as Qumran. The site was not a random collection of pyramids. Its layout was a direct reflection of the social and political world described in the Popol Vuh. Archaeologists identified distinct ceremonial plazas and platforms that corresponded precisely to the manuscript's descriptions of council houses for the ruling lineages, the Nima Rojpap Achij. The text spoke of specific buildings for deliberation and ritual, and the ruins revealed a central acropolis with exactly such specialized structures arranged around plazas, designed for gathering and ceremony. Even the natural defensive position of the city, on a peninsula surrounded by deep ravines, matched the historical narrative of a chosen, secure capital for a powerful confederacy. The discovery did something remarkable. It grounded a cosmic story in the very real stone of a mountain citadel. The Popol Vuh was not just a tale of gods and heroes, it was also a foundational charter, a document that linked the Qumran people's divine right to rule with the physical space they inhabited. Every council platform unearthed was a stanza from the creation epic made manifest, proving that for the Maya, myth and history were not separate threads, but a single, tightly woven cord connecting the heavens to the earth, the story of creation to the stones of their capital. The cosmic stories of the Maya were grounded in stone, but across the world, another writer was determined to pin down the entire earth with words. In the 1st century before the Common Era, a Greek scholar named Strabo produced a monumental work, his Geographica. It was an attempt to catalogue the entire known world, its lands, its peoples, and its cities. Among his entries was a description of a place that seemed to strain credibility, the capital of the Nabatean Arabs, a city called Petra. Strabo wrote of a fabulously wealthy metropolis, not built on open ground but carved directly into the faces of towering cliffs, a fortress of rock. He detailed its ingenious water management system, a network of channels and cisterns that allowed life to flourish in the heart of a desert. For centuries after the fall of Rome, Petra vanished from European knowledge. Strabo's account was read by Renaissance scholars, but it was dismissed as an exaggeration, a traveler's tale of a mythical rock city that could not possibly exist. The idea of a major civilization thriving in such a barren landscape seemed like geographical fantasy. The location was lost, and with it, any proof of the geographer's claims. That proof would require not just an explorer, but a man willing to disguise himself. In 1812, a Swiss scholar and adventurer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, deeply learned in classical texts, was traveling through the Middle East under the alias Sheikh Ibrahim. He had heard local Bedouin stories of a lost city hidden within a remote canyon, a place they called Wadi Musa. Remembering Strabo's descriptions, he persuaded his guides to take him there under the pretext of making a sacrifice at the tomb of the prophet Aaron. What he saw when he emerged from the narrow, winding fissure known as the Sick took his breath away. Before him, glowing in the sun, was the magnificent facade of the treasury, Al-Kosne, carved flawlessly from the rose-red sandstone cliff. As he explored further, he found not just one tomb, but an entire city of sculpted monuments, temples, tombs, and a Roman-style theater, all hewn from the living rock. He also observed the very water channels and reservoirs that Strabo had mentioned, the ingenious engineering that made the desert bloom. Burckhardt's rediscovery was a thunderous confirmation. Every line Strabo had written was vindicated. Petra was not a myth. It was a masterpiece of human ingenuity, a real-world marvel that had been hiding in plain sight, preserved by the desert and local memory. This revelation did more than just add a spectacular site to the map. It restored faith in the meticulousness of an ancient scholar. Strabo was not dealing in legends. He was compiling a factual report from his sources, and Petra stood as a permanent monument to the power of taking an ancient text at its word. The rediscovery of Petra proved a geographer's word could be trusted. But what about the word of a merchant who claimed to have walked the earth for 24 years? For centuries, the most famous travelogue in the world was also the most hotly debated. Marco Polo's account of his journey to the court of Kublai Khan, dictated while imprisoned in Genoa, was met with both wonder and profound skepticism. Its descriptions of the wealth and scale of the Yuan dynasty seemed so extravagant that the book earned a dismissive nickname, Il Maligni, implying it contained a million lies. Critics argued Polo never went to China at all, that he had simply compiled stories from Persian traders in a Constantinople bazaar. How could one man have witnessed such marvels, they asked, from a palace roofed with gold to a form of currency made not of metal but of paper? The doubt was so pervasive that even on his deathbed, a priest reportedly urged him to recount his fabrications, to which Polo is said to have replied, "I did not tell half of what I saw." For generations, his book was shelved in a strange category, a fascinating but unreliable blend of fact and fantasy. The tide of opinion began to turn when sinologists and archaeologists started comparing his text with Chinese administrative records and material evidence. Polo's meticulous description of the Yuan capital, Khanbalik, the precursor to Beijing, aligned with the layout described in Chinese chronicles. He wrote of a grand, walled city with a precise grid of streets, a design confirmed by later excavations. His account of the Summer Palace, Xanadu, a sprawling complex of marble halls and hunting parks, was once the epitome of poetic myth. Yet archaeological work at the site in Inner Mongolia has revealed the foundations of that very palace, its scale and layout matching Polo's report of a luxurious seasonal retreat for the imperial court. Perhaps the most compelling validations came from the small, precise details that a compiler of hearsay would have gotten wrong. Polo described the use of paper money across the empire, stamped with the Khan's seal. He recounted the exact process of its production from the bark of mulberry trees, a detail corroborated by surviving Yuan dynasty banknotes and Chinese administrative texts. He noted the use of black stones that burned for heat, a clear reference to coal which was indeed mined and used in China long before it was common in Europe. He recorded the unique postal relay system, the YAM, with its stations and horses spaced at exact intervals, a system documented in Yuan law. Each of these specifics, once seen as unbelievable exaggerations, found its mirror in the historical record. The debate is not entirely settled. Some inconsistencies remain, but the overwhelming weight of evidence now suggests Marco Polo did walk the halls of Kublai Khan's court. His book was not a million lies, but a million details, many of which were simply too advanced, too strange for his European audience to believe. His account stands as a testament to a simple, powerful truth, that the most incredible reports are sometimes just faithful recordings of a world wider and more wondrous than our own imaginations dare to conceive. A king's remorse can echo for centuries. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, a powerful ruler named Ashoka governed the vast Mauryan Empire across the Indian subcontinent. After a particularly brutal military campaign, he experienced a profound change of heart, embracing the Buddhist principles of non-violence and compassion. He vowed to govern by moral law, or Dhamma, and to spread his new philosophy far and wide. His method was extraordinary. He had his edicts, his royal proclamations and teachings, carved onto massive stone pillars and rock faces across his kingdom. For over 1,000 years, these inscriptions stood as silent witnesses. Then, as empires fell and languages evolved, knowledge of how to read the ancient Brahmi script faded. The pillars themselves were often reused, toppled, or simply forgotten, their messages locked away in stone. Ashoka the Great slipped from verified history into the realm of legend, remembered primarily through Buddhist chronicles preserved in Sri Lanka, like the Mahavamsa. These texts spoke of a righteous emperor who erected pillars of law, but to many Western scholars and even some Indian historians, they seemed like pious hagiography, a religious ideal rather than a historical record. The idea of a pacifist empire spanning the subcontinent, documented by the ruler himself, was considered a beautiful myth. The search for a real, tangible Ashoka began with a clue from an unexpected source. British antiquarians and army officers in the 19th century started reporting strange, highly polished stone pillars in remote locations, topped with magnificent animal sculptures, most famously the four-lion capital found at Sarnath. These pillars bore no resemblance to later Indian art. Then, in 1837, a scholar named James Prinsep, working as an assay master at the Calcutta Mint, made a breakthrough. He managed to decipher the mysterious script on these pillars and rocks. The language was Prakrit, and the author was none other than Devanampiya Piyadasi, beloved of the gods Piyadasi. Cross-referencing with the Sri Lankan chronicles, the identity became clear. This was Ashoka. The messages he unlocked were breathtaking. They were not grand boasts of conquest, but personal reflections on governance. One edict expressed deep regret for the suffering caused by his early war. Others outlined policies for the welfare of his people, establishing hospitals for humans and animals, planting shade trees along roads, and appointing special officers to promote ethical conduct. The inscriptions did not just reveal a philosophy, they mapped an empire. By physically locating these edicts from modern-day Afghanistan in the west to Bangladesh in the east, from the Himalayas down to the Deccan Plateau in the south, archaeologists could trace the exact geographical reach of the Mauryan Empire for the first time. The chronicles were not myth, they were history. Each rediscovered pillar or rock face acted as a surveyor's mark, plotting the points of a real, sophisticated state that had unified a continent under a radical idea that a king's power should be measured not by the land he controlled, but by the moral well-being he fostered. The stone had spoken, transforming a saintly legend into a historical administrator whose very real edicts continue to challenge our notions of power to this day. The stone pillars of Ashoka revealed an empire of conscience, but other ancient texts were hidden not to proclaim power, but to protect forbidden knowledge. In the stark cliffs of Upper Egypt near the town of Nag Hammadi, a simple act of digging for fertilizer in 1945 unearthed something far more precious than any crop. A farmer discovered a sealed clay jar containing 13 leather-bound codices, books made of papyrus. Inside were over 50 different texts written in the Coptic language. These were not copies of the familiar New Testament. They contained works with names like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Secret Book of John. For centuries, these writings had only been known from the furious condemnations of early church fathers like Irenaeus, who labeled them dangerous heresies, distortions of the true faith created by misguided sects. The groups who cherished these texts, often called Gnostics, were dismissed by Orthodox history as a shadowy, perhaps largely mythical, philosophical fringe. Their complex cosmology, their emphasis on secret knowledge or gnosis as the path to salvation, and their alternative accounts of Jesus' teachings were considered theological fiction, the inventions of rivals long silenced by the mainstream church. The Nag Hammadi library changed everything. This was not a single, questionable manuscript, it was an entire hidden archive. The physical reality of these codices, carefully copied and buried for safekeeping, proved that Gnostic Christianity was not a phantom heresy. It was a vibrant, diverse, and widespread movement with its own communities, its own scribes, and its own rich literary tradition. The texts themselves offered a startling window into the real-world debates of the first few centuries after Jesus. They revealed a time of profound exploration, when different communities were wrestling with fundamental questions about divinity, the material world, and the nature of salvation. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, presents over 100 sayings of Jesus, many unfamiliar, focusing on inner discovery. Its existence did not rewrite the canonical Gospels, but it validated the historical fact that many such collections of teachings circulated, each shaping the faith of real people in real congregations. The discovery forced a monumental shift in understanding. Early Christianity was not a monolithic faith that spread in a straight line, but a tumultuous marketplace of ideas, where what became orthodoxy was just one voice among many for a very long time. The Nag Hammadi codices, buried in the Egyptian sand, were a time capsule from that lost world of debate, proving that the so-called myths condemned by the winners of history were, in fact, the sacred scriptures of the communities that lost. While some texts were hidden to preserve forbidden knowledge, others were almost destroyed for being incomprehensible. The Dresden Codex is one of only 4 surviving pre-Columbian Maya books, a fragile screenfold manuscript of bark paper coated in stucco. For centuries after it arrived in a European library, its vividly painted pages of gods, serpents, and complex numerical tables were viewed as little more than an exotic curiosity, a priest's astrological manual filled with impenetrable and likely superstitious calculations. Its precise charts tracking the movements of Venus and predicting eclipses seemed like mystical numerology, the work of a culture obsessed with celestial omens rather than true science. The book was a beautiful artifact, but its content was dismissed as opaque myth, a relic of primitive cosmology. This perception could not survive the meticulous work of 20th century scholars who finally cracked the Mayas' sophisticated calendrical and mathematical systems. As epigraphers deciphered the hieroglyphs on stone monuments across the Maya world, a stunning pattern emerged. The complex astronomical data in the Dresden Codex was not abstract speculation, it was pinpoint accurate observational science. The Codex contains a Venus table that charts the planet's 584-day synodic period with extraordinary precision, allowing priests to predict its appearances as the morning and evening star years in advance. Even more remarkably, it includes tables for predicting solar eclipses, a feat requiring advanced long-term celestial mechanics. These were not just numbers on a page, they were blueprints for power, and they were etched into the very stones of Maya cities. At the Great Observatory of Chichen Itza, known as El Caracol, the architectural alignments of windows and doorways correspond precisely to the extreme rising and setting points of Venus as calculated in the Dresden Codex. The Pyramid of Kukulkan at the same site is famously designed to cast a shadow serpent during the equinoxes, a dramatic fusion of astronomy, architecture, and civic ritual predicted by such calendars. Further south at Kapan, inscriptions on stelae record historical events timed to coincide with specific celestial cycles documented in the Codex, linking the authority of kings directly to the predictable motion of the heavens. The validation was complete. The Dresden Codex was transformed from an obscure book of omens into one of the most sophisticated scientific documents of the ancient world. It proved the Maya were not just stargazers, they were master astronomers and mathematicians who built their cities as monumental stone calendars, harmonizing their society with the cosmic order. The codex was their operational manual, and the ruins were their proof of concept, showing that their myths about time and the gods were rooted in a profound, empirical understanding of the sky itself. The Maya did not just watch the stars, they wrote their own history in the pages of books they called screenfolds. One of the most remarkable of these is the Annals of the Kaqchiquels, a chronicle written in the Kaqchikel Maya language shortly after the Spanish arrival. This text is not a distant myth, it is a gripping, first-hand historical narrative. It tells the story of the Kaqchikel people, their long migration from the legendary city of Chelan, their rise to power, their bitter conflict with their former allies the Kayich, and the eventual founding of their own magnificent capital, Iximch. For a long time, this detailed chronicle was treated by outsiders primarily as a linguistic treasure or a post-conquest justification. Its descriptions of a grand hilltop city seen as perhaps an idealized memory of a lost home. Where was this Iximch, this fortress capital from which the Kaqchikel lords ruled? The annals gave very specific clues describing its defensive position, its layout of plazas and temples, and its ultimate tragic siege by Spanish forces. Guided by these descriptions, archaeologists turned their attention to the Guatemalan highlands. In a region of pine forests near the modern town of Tecpon, they found a site that matched the text in every particular. Iximch was not a legend, it was a sprawling, fortified city built across several hilltops, surrounded by deep ravines that formed a natural moat. Excavations revealed exactly what the annals described: twin ceremonial plazas, each with its own temple pyramids and palaces for the ruling lineages, just as the Kaqchikel social structure dictated. The material evidence told a story of both power and conflict. Researchers found artifacts that spoke of the city's wealth and its trade connections, but also clear signs of the warfare mentioned in the text. Defensive walls and the strategic placement of the city confirmed the ongoing rivalry with the Kayich. Most poignantly, the archaeology aligned with the annals' account of the Spanish conquest. Evidence of a sudden, violent end was found, including burned structures and hastily buried ceremonial items, mirroring the written description of Pedro de Alvarado's siege and the city's fall in 1524. The discovery did something profound. It turned a historical document into a living map. Every plaza, every temple platform unearthed was a sentence from the annals written in stone and earth. It proved that this indigenous history, recorded in the aftermath of catastrophe, was a meticulous factual account, not a romanticized fable. The ruins of Iximch stand as a direct bridge between the written word and the physical world, a testament to a people who preserved the truth of their own story against the tide of oblivion. The annals of Iximch proved a people could preserve their history in the face of conquest, but another nation built its very identity around a single, sacred text. For Ethiopia, that foundational document is the Kebra Nagast, the glory of the kings. This epic, compiled in the 14th century, weaves a story of divine destiny, connecting the nation's rulers directly to biblical antiquity. It tells of the legendary Queen of Sheba's journey to Jerusalem, her union with King Solomon, and the birth of their son, Menelik I. The narrative's most stunning claim is that Menelik, as a young man, returned to Jerusalem and, guided by divine will, brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Ethiopia, where it has been guarded ever since. To outside observers for centuries, this was the purest myth, a powerful but fanciful origin story crafted to legitimize a Christian kingdom in Africa. The Grand Kingdom of Aksum, from which the Solomonic dynasty claimed descent, was considered a semi-legendary place, its power and sophistication likely exaggerated by the epic's authors. The Kebra Nagast was revered as a spiritual and national symbol, but its historical claims were largely dismissed by the wider world. This skepticism began to crumble in the dry highlands of northern Ethiopia. There, the modern town of Aksum sits amidst the silent, monumental ruins of an ancient empire. Towering, intricately carved stone obelisks or stelae, some over 70 feet tall, pierce the sky, marking the tombs of Aksumite kings. These are not the works of a minor chiefdom, they are the signatures of a major power. Excavations revealed the foundations of massive palaces, sophisticated water reservoirs, and a bustling city that was a central node in trade networks stretching from the Roman Empire to India. Most compellingly, royal inscriptions were found, written in the ancient Ge'ez language, naming kings and detailing military campaigns that matched accounts from outside sources, like the previously mentioned Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. The archaeology confirmed every material claim the Khebra Nagast made about the Aksumite kingdom's grandeur. It was a real, wealthy, and literate civilization that minted its own coinage and corresponded with emperors. The epic's descriptions of a powerful capital, of royal lineage, and of a deeply Christian state by the 4th century were not fabrications. They were poetic reflections of a verified historical reality. The Khebra Nagast, therefore, performs a dual role. It contains miraculous, faith-based narratives that stand outside archaeological proof, yet it is also anchored in the very real stones of Aksum. The text did not invent a glorious past, it interpreted and sacralized one that already existed in ruined palaces and inscribed pillars. This validation transforms the epic from mere legend into a cultural map, showing how a nation's deepest stories are often built upon the unshakable foundation of a real and truly remarkable history. The quest to find a river's beginning is a puzzle that can last for millennia. In the 2nd century, a Greco-Roman scholar in Alexandria named Claudius Ptolemy attempted to solve the greatest geographical puzzle of the ancient world, the source of the Nile. In his seminal work, the Geographia, he compiled all known knowledge of the earth, and for the Nile, he proposed a theory based on reports from traders and travelers. His maps and texts suggested the great river did not spring from a single mountain, but from 2 large inland lakes nestled among snow-capped peaks he called the Mountains of the Moon. For over 1,500 years, as Ptolemy's work was copied and preserved by Arab scholars and later rediscovered in Renaissance Europe, this idea was treated as intelligent speculation at best and pure cartographic myth at worst. Without any European ever having seen these lakes or mountains, they remained elegant fiction on a vellum map, a classical scholar's best guess about a blank space on the globe. The interior of Africa was a sealed book, and Ptolemy's lakes were its most famous imaginary illustration. This perception defined exploration for centuries, with every failed expedition seeming to confirm that the ancients, for all their wisdom, had simply invented an answer to an unanswerable question. The turning point came in the 19th century, when the race to find the Nile's source became a grand Victorian obsession. Explorers like Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke plunged into the uncharted heart of the continent, armed with modern instruments and Ptolemy's ancient text as a cryptic guide. What they found was nothing short of a revelation. Speke, pushing north from the coast, first laid eyes on a vast inland sea in 1858. He named it Lake Victoria, and he immediately proclaimed it the long-sought source of the White Nile. The controversy was fierce, Burton disagreed, and the academic world was deeply skeptical. Yet further exploration by others, like Samuel Baker, who discovered Lake Albert, began to paint a startling picture. There was not one lake, but a whole region of them, the African Great Lakes, precisely in the region Ptolemy had indicated. Even more astonishingly, these lakes were indeed fed by streams from the Awenzori Mountains, a range whose snowy peaks were locally known long before European contact, and whose glimmering summits perfectly matched the description of the legendary Mountains of the Moon. Ptolemy had been right. His information, passed down through a chain of intermediaries over vast distances, was not a guess, it was a report. the validation was a profound lesson in humility for modern geography. It proved that ancient knowledge networks, though fragile and indirect, could transmit remarkably accurate information across continents and centuries. The lakes were not a myth, they were a fact waiting for the world to catch up, a testament to the idea that the blank spaces on our oldest maps were not always empty, but were sometimes simply written in a language of reportage that later generations had forgotten how to read. The quest for a river's source can become a search for the very cradle of a civilization. Among the oldest texts in any Indo-European language, the Rigveda stands as a foundation of Hindu thought, a collection of hymns composed in an archaic form of Sanskrit over 3,000 years ago. Within its sacred verses, one river is praised above all others, not the mighty Ganges but the Sarasvati. The hymns describe it in majestic terms, calling it the best of rivers, great among the great, a mighty flood that flowed from the mountains to the sea, nourishing a vibrant culture along its banks. For a very long time, this description presented a profound puzzle. In the modern landscape of northwest India, no such grand river exists. There is only a seasonal stream called the Gaga Hakra, which dries up in the desert long before reaching the ocean. This glaring discrepancy led generations of scholars, both Indian and Western, to a logical conclusion. The Sarasvati of the Rigveda must be a mythological river, a symbolic artery of purity and abundance, or perhaps an allegory for speech or consciousness within the Vedic spiritual framework. Its detailed geography was seen as a poetic device, placing a sacred ideal within a familiar but imagined landscape. The text was revered, but its central geographical claim was largely dismissed as a beautiful fiction. This interpretation began to unravel not through archaeology alone, but from the vantage point of space. In the late 20th century, satellite imagery and remote sensing technology revealed something startling hidden beneath the sands of the Thar Desert. The images showed the clear, sinuous ghost of an immense paleo-channel, a dried-up riverbed far wider than any existing watercourse in the region. Geological surveys on the ground confirmed it, finding sediments characteristic of a large, perennial river system. This was the remnant of a mighty river that had once flowed with vigor, fed by glaciers from the Himalayas. Its course, traced from the Siwalik Hills through what is now Punjab, Haryana, and Rajasthan, before eventually fading into the plains of Gujarat, aligned almost perfectly with the geographical descriptions of the Sarasvati in the Rigvedic hymns. The correlation was too precise to be coincidence. The hymns were not describing a myth, they were preserving a memory, a cultural recollection of a real, life-giving river that had sustained early Vedic society. This validation forces a dramatic rethinking of early Indian history. It suggests the core region of Vedic civilization, often called the Sapta Sindhu, or Land of the Seven Rivers, was centered not just on the Indus but on this now vanished giant. The river's gradual decline, likely due to tectonic shifts altering its tributaries and changing climate patterns, would have been a catastrophic event for the communities that depended on it, an event that may have been encoded in the texts as the river's gradual disappearance or descent underground. The discovery transforms the Rigveda from a purely theological work into a historical witness. Its hymns become a eulogy for a lost landscape, a powerful reminder that the most sacred stories are often those that mourn a real, physical world that has slipped away, preserving its map in the unwavering lines of poetry. The poetry of the Rigveda mourned a lost river, but another set of texts hidden in jars within desert caves preserved the voice of a lost community. For centuries, historians studying the Second Temple period of Judaism relied on a handful of outside observers. Writers like the Roman Pliny the Elder and the Jewish historian Josephus mentioned a strict, ascetic Jewish sect living near the Dead Sea, known as the Essenes. They described them as celibate, communal, and deeply devoted to ritual purity, waiting for a coming apocalyptic conflict. Yet without any of the Essenes' own writings, these accounts felt distant, perhaps even exaggerated by their authors. The Essenes remained a scholarly phantom, a footnote in religious history known only through the words of others. That all changed with a stray goat and a thrown rock. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost animal in the cliffs west of the Dead Sea tossed a stone into a cave opening and heard the sound of breaking pottery. Investigating, he found clay jars containing ancient leather and papyrus scrolls. This chance discovery ignited a search that would uncover an entire library hidden in 11 caves. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls. The contents were breathtaking. They included the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible by 1,000 years, but also rules, commentaries, hymns, and apocalyptic visions unique to the community that wrote them. Just below the caves, archaeologists excavated the ruins of a settlement at a place called Qumran. The site revealed a communal dining hall, ritual baths, a scriptorium with inkwells where the scrolls were likely copied, and a cemetery with over 1,000 graves laid out in orderly rows. The material evidence painted a picture of a devout, isolated community living a life of shared work and intense study. The connection was undeniable. The scrolls described a group calling itself the Yahad, the community, with rules that mirrored the ancient descriptions of the Essenes in almost every detail, from their shared property and strict initiation process to their expectation of an imminent war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The archaeological site of Qumran provided the physical stage, and the scrolls provided the script, a community that had existed only as a second-hand report in history. Books suddenly had a tangible address, a daily routine, and most importantly, its own voice. The validation was profound. It proved that the sectarian movements of the time were not just ideological abstractions, but real, living communities with their own libraries and interpretations. The scrolls did not just confirm a historical reference, they opened a direct window into the spiritual ferment of an era, revealing the diverse landscape of belief from which both modern Judaism and early Christianity would later emerge. The caves of Qumran held not just parchment, but the resurrected consciousness of a people who believed they were preparing for the end of the world, leaving behind a library so that their truth might survive its own destruction. A nation's history is written by those who survived the storm. For England, one of its most vital historical records is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a series of manuscripts begun under the reign of Alfred the Great, compiling year-by-year entries of events deemed important by monastic scribes. One entry for the year 793 is stark and chilling. It reads, "Terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and miserably frightened the people." And a little after that, on the 8th of January, the ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. This was the first recorded Viking raid on English soil, an event that would echo for centuries as the opening chapter of a terrifying new age. Yet, as historians in later centuries scrutinized the chronicle, questions arose. Could the monastic scribes, writing with the benefit of hindsight, have exaggerated the severity of this first attack to frame the Vikings as a divine punishment? Was the precise date and the description of brutal robbery more a literary trope than a factual report? Some scholars quietly suggested the raid might have been a smaller, opportunistic hit rather than the cataclysmic event described, its timing and impact perhaps blurred by time and fear. The chronicle was a crucial source, but like any text, it was subject to the bias of its authors, leading some to wonder if the true story of Lindisfarne was more myth than measured history. The island itself, however, held evidence that would not remain silent. Archaeological excavations at Lindisfarne, the site of the famed monastery where the illuminated Lindisfarne Gospels were created, began to reveal a story written not in ink, but in broken stone and buried treasure. Researchers unearthed fragments of intricately carved stone crosses and shrine decorations that had been violently shattered, their pieces scattered and found in context suggesting they were damaged during a single, devastating event. Even more telling were the discoveries of coin hoards. Several caches of silver coins, known as seaters, were found buried near the monastic site. The latest coins in these hoards dated to precisely the period around 793. This pattern is a classic archaeological signature of sudden, extreme crisis, people hiding their wealth in a moment of panic, intending to return for it when the danger passed, but never able to do so. The physical evidence painted a clear and somber picture. A thriving center of art and scholarship was indeed violently disrupted at the very time the chronicle recorded. The broken shrine fragments spoke of a targeted desecration, while the abandoned coin hoards whispered of a terrified community fleeing for their lives. The archaeology did not just confirm the event, it confirmed its traumatic nature, validating the chronicler's grim choice of words. This convergence of text and earth does more than verify a date. It allows us to hear the true tone of that distant entry in the Anglo-Saxon chronicle. It transforms the words from potential exaggeration into a stark, first-hand report of a world suddenly and irrevocably changed, proving that sometimes the most chilling historical accounts are the ones that prove to be understatements. A royal seat of power often lives on long after its last king has fallen. In the misty hills of what is now Northern Ireland, one such place lingered in memory as the epicenter of an entire cycle of legends. The Tain Bo Cuailnge, or the cattle raid of Cooley, is the great Irish epic that forms the heart of the Ulster cycle. It is a sprawling tale of heroes like Cú Chulainn, of rivalries, magic, and a war sparked by the theft of a single, phenomenally fertile bull. At the core of this legendary world stands Emain Macha, described as the royal capital of the Ulaid, the warriors of Ulster. For centuries, scholars treated the Tain as magnificent literature, a foundational myth for Irish identity, but its geography was considered a landscape of the imagination. Emain Macha, with its great halls and royal enclosures, was seen as a symbolic heartland, not a place you could ever point to on a map. The stories were powerful, but they belonged to the realm of bardic poetry, not to the hard soil of archaeology. That distinction began to blur at a windswept hill known as Navan Fort. For a long time, this grassy mound was just another ancient site, but its traditional Irish name was unmistakable: Imhain Mhacha. The link was tantalizing, but where was the proof? Excavations at Navan Fort revealed something extraordinary. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of a massive, circular structure dating to around 100 before the Common Era. This was no ordinary dwelling. It was a gigantic ritual building, nearly 130 feet in diameter, constructed from towering oak posts. The evidence suggested it was never meant for daily life, but for a single, spectacular purpose. The structure appears to have been deliberately filled with thousands of stones, then crowned with a central wooden pillar, before being set ablaze in a controlled, ceremonial fire. The entire site was then covered with a monumental earthwork, creating the mound we see today. This was not a defensive fort. It was a temple or a royal inauguration site on a staggering scale. The ritual deposits found there, including the skull of a Barbary ape from North Africa, spoke of far-flung trade connections and immense prestige, exactly the kind of wealth and power you would expect at the capital of a legendary kingdom. The identification became inescapable. Navan Fort was the historical Emain Macha. The validation was profound. It meant the epic Ulster cycle was not floating in a mythical void. It was anchored to a specific, powerful place. The descriptions of warrior bands gathering, of royal disputes, and of a centralized Ulster authority suddenly had a tangible stage. the Bamboo Annals transformed from pure myth into a poetic memory of a real Iron Age society, its heroes perhaps echoing the deeds of historical champions, its conflicts reflecting the very real tensions of a tribal kingdom centered on this ritual complex. The stones and post holes of Navan Fort gave a geographical heart to Ireland's greatest epic, proving that even the most fantastical tales of heroes and magic bulls can grow from the sacred soil of a very real ceremonial center. The weight of a legendary dynasty can rest on the shoulders of a turtle. For centuries, the official histories of China, written long after the events they described, told of a glorious founding era, the Xia dynasty. These texts, like the Bamboo Annals and the records of the Grand Historian, presented the Xia as the first hereditary kingdom, a model of virtuous rule that laid the cultural and political foundations for all that followed. Yet as modern historical methods developed, a profound skepticism took hold. With no contemporary written records, no identified capital city, and no archaeological culture definitively labeled as Xia, most Western scholars and many Chinese historians concluded it was a myth, a later philosophical construct created to give antiquity a moral blueprint. The Xia were seen as a necessary fiction, a golden age invented by Confucian scholars to illustrate the principles of good governance. This left the Shang dynasty, the next in the traditional sequence, also hovering in a semi-legendary haze, attested in texts but not yet proven by the earth itself. The entire foundation of early Chinese history seemed built on sand. The turning point came not from a grand city but from a pharmacy. In the late 19th century, fragments of ancient bone and turtle shell, inscribed with strange markings, began appearing in Chinese medicinal shops sold as dragon bones for grinding into potions. Scholars recognized the markings as an archaic form of Chinese writing, and a desperate race began to find their source before they were all pulverized and consumed. The trail led to a place called Anyang. There, systematic excavations in the 1920s and 30s uncovered the ruins of a magnificent capital, complete with royal tombs, bronze foundries, and palaces. This was Yin, the last great capital of the Shang dynasty, but the true treasure was the sheer volume of inscribed oracle bones, tens of thousands of them. These were records of divination, where kings posed questions to ancestral spirits about war, harvests, and illness, and the cracks made by heated rods were interpreted as answers. The inscriptions provided a stunningly detailed royal genealogy, listing Shang kings in an order that matched with remarkable consistency the accounts in the later historical texts. The Shang dynasty was no longer legend, it was a documented, literate, and powerful state. Yet the oracle bones did something even more profound for the Xia. While they did not mention the Xia by that specific name, they consistently referred to a powerful, organized political entity that had preceded the Shang, using terms that implied a legitimate transfer of the mandate of heaven. The Shang kings were asking their ancestors about rituals and relations concerning these earlier powers, treating them as historical predecessors, not mythical figures. This provided crucial indirect evidence. It showed that the Shang themselves believed they had succeeded a previous dynastic system, a real political order that had held sway over the Central Plains. The archaeological framework at Anyang proved the historical texts were reliable for the period they directly documented, which in turn lent immense credibility to their earlier chapters. The discovery created a powerful chain of validation. The oracle bones proved the Shang, and the Shang's own records pointed to something before them. This did not instantly identify the Xia with a specific archaeological site, a quest that continues today, but it transformed the dynasty from philosophical fiction into a highly probable historical reality, a missing piece in a puzzle that now had a firmly established border. The humble oracle bone, once nearly ingested as medicine, became the key that unlocked the door to China's deepest past, suggesting that sometimes the proof of a legend is not found in its own name, but in the respectful acknowledgments of those who came after. Conquest creates a new kind of map, one drawn not for exploration but for accounting. In the chaotic years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spanish administrators demanded to understand the empire they had just overthrown. In response, indigenous scribes and artists working under Spanish direction created a remarkable document known as the Codex Mendoza. This book was part history, part ethnographic guide, and part economic report. Its most staggering section was a detailed pictorial list, a catalogue of the annual tribute owed to the Aztec rulers by hundreds of conquered cities. Page after page depicted bundles of feathers, bags of cocoa beans, jade beads, warrior costumes, and rolls of cotton cloth, each with a precise numerical count. To the Spanish officials receiving it, and to later historians studying it, this was an administrative document, but its content seemed almost fantastical. The sheer volume and variety of goods, flowing from every corner of Mesoamerica to a single capital, appeared exaggerated, a boastful representation of imperial power meant to impress the new overlords, or perhaps an idealized template of how the system was supposed to work, rather than how it actually did. Could a pre-industrial state really coordinate the collection and redistribution of such a vast, delicate array of commodities from such distant and diverse landscapes? The tribute lists were fascinating, but were they fact? The codex itself became a historical artifact, its claims hovering in a space between record and propaganda. The truth, however, was not confined to the page. It was scattered across thousands of miles, waiting in the soil of subject cities and trade hubs. Decades of archaeology began to assemble a material picture that spoke directly to the codex's inventories. At sites far from the Valley of Mexico, in regions like Oaxaca and Guerrero, researchers found evidence of specialized production on an industrial scale. Workshops were uncovered that produced nothing but certain types of pottery or obsidian blades in standardized forms, matching the types listed as tribute items. The discovery of vast quantities of specific goods in centralized storerooms at Aztec provincial centers indicated organized collection points. Perhaps most compelling was the evidence of goods traveling far from their origin. The vibrant feathers of tropical quetzal birds, listed prominently in the codex, were found in ceremonial contexts in the highland capital, their presence only possible through a controlled network of acquisition from the distant cloud forests of Guatemala. Jade from a single source in the Motagua River Valley, also a listed tribute item, was found worked into identical ornaments at sites across the empire, suggesting state-controlled distribution of raw materials. Even perishable items like cocoa beans left their mark, with specific pottery forms used for drinking chocolate becoming widespread in elite contexts, paid for with the very beans used as currency. Each archaeological find acted as a corroborating receipt for an entry in the ancient ledger. The Codex Mendoza was not an idealized fantasy. It was a literal balance sheet for a complex imperial economy. Its validation reveals the Aztec Empire not just as a military power, but as a sophisticated logistical engine, capable of integrating diverse ecosystems into a single economic machine, transforming feathers, stones, and beans into the very glue that held a realm together. The scribes who painted those meticulous lists were not exaggerating. They were simply documenting the mundane, breathtaking reality of how an empire functioned, one precious feather at a time. Even the most meticulous geographer can be undone by a story that seems too strange to believe. The Greek explorer Pytheas of Massalia set sail from the Mediterranean around 325 years before the Common Era, venturing farther north than any literate traveler before him. He returned with an account of a voyage that stretched beyond the known world, a written work he called On the Ocean. In its pages, he described the cold, misty coasts of a land he called Thule, a place where the sun barely set in summer and the sea became a sluggish, congealed substance. Most tantalizingly, he wrote of a northern shore, an amber coast, where the golden, fossilized resin washed up in such abundance that locals used it for fuel. To the intellectual establishment of the later Roman world, particularly the geographer Strabo, these claims were laughable. Strabo, sitting in the libraries of Rome and Alexandria, dismissed Pytheas as a fabricator, a teller of tall tales. The idea of a navigable sea turning to slush, of a land of midnight sun, and of amber being so common it was burned like firewood, all of it seemed like the fantastic invention of a man seeking fame. For centuries, Pytheas's lost work survived only in these scornful fragments quoted by his detractors, and his Thule remained a byword for the edge of fantasy, a mythical place on a map of lies. The truth, however, was not written on papyrus, but buried along ancient trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles. Modern archaeology across Europe began to uncover a startling material reality. From the shores of the Baltic Sea, in regions like modern Denmark and Poland, excavations revealed evidence of intensive amber collection dating back to the Bronze Age. Workshops were found where the raw, golden lumps were carefully shaped into beads, pendants, and intricate figurines. This alone proved amber's local abundance. But the real revelation came from tracing where these finished objects ended up. Spectacular hoards of Baltic amber were discovered in Mycenaean tombs in Greece, within the royal burial at Katna in Syria, and even in the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt. Chemical fingerprinting techniques confirmed the source. This amber had traveled from the cold north to the sun-baked centers of Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilization. The trade routes were not mythical. They were highways of commerce with way stations and exchange points identified through archaeological finds across Central Europe. Pytheas had not invented an amber coast. He had accurately reported on the economic engine of an entire region. His account was not a sailor's fantasy, but a merchant's keen observation of a lucrative resource at its point of origin. The very detail that Strabo found most ridiculous, that amber was so plentiful it could be burned, was likely a misunderstood report of its use in ceremonial fires or a metaphor for its staggering natural wealth. The fragments of Pytheas, preserved through the contempt of his critics, were ultimately vindicated by the silent, golden journey of amber itself, proving that sometimes a story is rejected not because it is false, but because it describes a world so distant and unfamiliar that it strains the imagination of those who have never dared to leave their libraries. Poetry can serve as the most elegant form of historical survey. In 8th century Japan, a monumental collection known as the Manyoshu was compiled, gathering over 4,000 poems from emperors and soldiers, farmers and courtiers. Its verses spoke of love and loss, of the beauty of the seasons, and of the landscape itself. Among its recurring subjects were the great capital cities, Fujiwara Kyo and Hijo Kyo, the latter being what we now call Nara. The poems described their grand avenues, their palaces shimmering in the morning mist, and the vibrant, often poignant, human drama that unfolded within their walls. For a very long time, these descriptions were cherished as the pinnacle of Japanese literary art, but their physical settings were shrouded in uncertainty. The precise locations and layouts of these early capitals, which moved with each new reign according to tradition, were lost to time, their grandeur preserved only in the delicate syllables of verse. The Manyoshu was a national treasure, but its geography was considered poetic, not cartographic. That perception began to change in the 20th century, when archaeologists turned to the flat plains near modern Nara, guided by the anthology's subtle clues and surviving local place names. Their excavations uncovered something astonishing: the complete ground plans of these legendary cities. At the site of Fujiwara Kyo, Japan's first full-fledged capital built on a Chinese grid pattern, researchers mapped out the outlines of the great palace enclosure, the Suzoku Gate, and the wide, straight avenues described in the poems. At Hyjokyo, an even larger and more magnificent capital, they unearthed the foundation stones of the imperial palace, the Daigokuden, or Great Hall of State, where emperors held court. They traced the administrative districts where bureaucrats worked and the temple complexes that grew alongside the government center. But the archaeology did more than just confirm the city plans. It breathed life into the poetry itself. Artifacts recovered from the sites, like delicate courtiers' combs, fragments of colorful painted screens, and meticulously inscribed wooden tablets used for record-keeping, mirrored the daily world referenced in the Manyoshu. A poem about a lonely lover waiting by a gate gained new resonance when archaeologists could identify the very gate structure. Descriptions of ceremonial processions down the central boulevard became tangible when the boulevard's exact width and composition were revealed. The excavation validated the anthology as a document of profound historical witness. It proved that the poets were not just crafting beautiful imagery, they were recording the sensory reality of their world, the view from a specific balcony, the sound of carts on a particular street, the feeling of a specific place at a specific time. The stones and tiles of the ancient capitals gave a permanent address to the fleeting emotions captured in the poems, showing that the most enduring history is often written not in chronicles of power, but in the heartfelt verses of people simply living their lives in a city that would one day vanish, only to be faithfully remembered in song. The Manyoshu proved poetry could map a city's soul, but what about a story that claimed to map the very beginning of urban life itself? Deep within the literary tradition of ancient Mesopotamia lies a fragmentary text known today as the Eridu Genesis. This Sumerian creation myth, preserved on broken clay tablets, presents a sweeping narrative. It tells of the gods creating humanity to serve them, of a great flood sent to wipe out a noisy, bothersome mankind, and of a wise king named Ziusudra who builds a boat to survive the deluge. But before any of that, the text makes a foundational declaration. It names a specific place as the very first city ever built, the place where kingship first descended from the heavens, the primordial settlement from which all civilization flowed. That place was Eridu. For generations of scholars reading these fragments, this claim seemed like classic mythic logic. Of course, a culture would venerate its most ancient cult center as the birthplace of all cities, elevating it to a symbolic, almost metaphysical status. Eridu was treated as a concept, a sacred idea, the mythical Garden of Eden of the Sumerian world. Its physical reality was doubted, considered perhaps a minor site exaggerated by poetic tradition, or even a complete fiction serving a theological purpose. The tablets were fascinating, but their geography was not taken literally. The desert sands of southern Iraq, however, held a very different truth. Archaeologists began excavating a massive, lonely mound known as Tel Abu Sharain. As they peeled back the layers, they uncovered not just a city, but a staggering timeline. Eridu was real, and it was ancient beyond belief. The settlement's origins stretched back to around 5,400 years before the Common Era, making it one of, if not the oldest permanent settlements in all of Mesopotamia. The city's growth was a physical chronicle of urban birth, showing a simple fishing village gradually transforming into a major religious and political center over millennia. But the most stunning validation of the myth came from the very heart of the site. Excavators uncovered a sequence of temples, one built directly atop the other, creating a towering archaeological layer cake of devotion. At the bottom, the earliest shrine was a simple, small structure. With each rebuilding, it grew larger and more elaborate, culminating in a magnificent ziggurat. And every single one of these temples across thousands of years was dedicated to the same god, Enki, the deity of wisdom, fresh water, and creation. This was the precise theological importance granted to Eridu in the Eridu Genesis, the city of Enki, the first home of the gods. The myth was not inventing a symbolic past. It was accurately reporting a cultural memory so deep it had become sacred. The continuous temple sequence proved Eridu's enduring, paramount status in the Sumerian mind. The city's extraordinary antiquity provided the factual bedrock for the legend, the real-world reason why later generations would look back and say, everything began here. The discovery did more than just find an old city. It revealed how history hardens into myth. The Eridu Genesis was using the genuine, awe-inspiring antiquity of a place to answer the most profound questions. Where do we come from, and how did our ordered world begin? The answer was not in the stars, but in the bricks and sand of a very real, very ancient city that had never truly been forgotten, only waiting for its story to be read not as fantasy, but as the long, whispered memory of a beginning. The very ground of a tomb can become a library, preserving a history meant to be forgotten. Centuries after the fall of the Shang, a text of immense controversy was sealed away, the Bamboo Annals. This chronicle, discovered in a tomb from the Warring States period, presented a stark and unflinching narrative of China's earliest dynasties, including a detailed, year-by-year account of the Zhou conquest that toppled the Shang. Its tone was strikingly different from the more polished, moralizing official histories. It included omens, specific dates, and events that seemed almost too candid, including reports of natural disasters and political strife that later dynasties might have preferred to erase. For generations, this very rawness made scholars deeply suspicious. The annals were declared a later forgery, a clever fabrication from a much later era designed to look ancient. Its timeline was dismissed as unreliable, its dramatic stories seen as inventive fiction crafted to fill the silent gaps of a half-remembered past. The chronicle was relegated to the margins, a fascinating but untrustworthy outlier. Yet the slow, patient work of archaeology began to assemble a new kind of evidence, one written not on bamboo slips but in enduring bronze. As more ritual vessels from the early Zhou period were unearthed, their inscriptions, cast into the metal to commemorate ceremonies and victories, started to speak. These were not histories written with hindsight, they were contemporary records frozen in time by the people who lived it. Astonishingly, the names, events, and even the specific phrasing found in these bronze inscriptions began to echo the accounts in the Bamboo Annals. A vessel might name a Zhou king or a battle that the annals also described, aligning not just in general outline but in precise, corroborating detail. The chronological framework of the annals, once dismissed as fabricated, started to find a strange harmony with the independent evidence from the artifacts. Even the annals recording of unusual celestial events, like specific planetary alignments or eclipses, could be checked against modern astronomical retrocalculations, and several were found to be accurate for the proposed timeframe. This convergence of sources was transformative. The Bamboo Annals was no longer an isolated, suspect document. It was a key that helped interpret the silent testimony of the bronzes. Its candid, sometimes chaotic narrative began to look less like forgery and more like a genuine, unvarnished attempt to record events as they were understood, preserving a version of history that official chroniclers later smoothed over. The tomb that hid it had not safeguarded a lie, but a counterpoint, a vital witness to the turbulent, real-world transition of power from one dynasty to the next, proving that the most contested texts are sometimes the ones closest to the raw truth of their age. A story of origins can be written in the stones of a tomb. Across the Irish Sea, a very different kind of manuscript sought to explain the very beginning of a people. The Liber Gabala Eren, the Book of Invasions, is a complex medieval compilation that weaves history, legend, and biblical genealogy into a single epic. It tells of Ireland being settled by a series of mythical waves, each new group of arrivals overcoming the last. One of these early peoples, the Tuatha De Danann, are described as god-like figures of great skill and magic. But another, earlier wave is given a more tangible legacy. They are remembered as the Fir Bolg and the people of Nemd, often described as mighty builders of great earthen forts and tombs. For centuries, scholars read this as pure mythopoetic invention, a fanciful narrative created by Christian monks to graft Ireland's pagan past onto a biblical timeline and to explain the origins of the island's many mysterious ancient monuments. The Liber Gabála was a literary masterpiece, but its historical claims were seen as symbolic, a way to give a voice to a pre-literate age through the lens of legend. The text spoke of these early settlers raising great mounds, but no one seriously believed it was a factual record of who built them. That belief was challenged not by a document, but by a silent, majestic structure older than the Egyptian pyramids. At a bend in the River Boyne, the massive, grass-covered mound of Newgrange dominates the landscape. For generations, it was known locally as a ferry mound, a place of the Sidhe, often associated with the Tuatha De Danann of the legends. When archaeologists began to excavate in the 20th century, they uncovered the truth. This was a monumental passage tomb, constructed over 5,000 years ago by a sophisticated Neolithic society. The precision of its architecture was breathtaking, its entrance stone carved with intricate spirals, and its inner chamber engineered so that on the winter solstice, a single shaft of sunlight pierces the darkness to illuminate the central chamber. This was not a fort or a fairy palace, it was a temple of the dead and a celestial observatory, built by a real people with profound astronomical knowledge and social organization. The discovery forced a radical rethinking of the Liber Gabála. While its sequence of invasions and its divine characters were clearly mythologized, its core memory of a distant, powerful tomb-building people was not invented. The medieval scribes were preserving a genuine folk tradition, an oral memory passed down for over 4 millennia that remembered that the landscape's oldest, most awe-inspiring monuments were raised by a race that came long, long before. The Fir Bolg, the builders of the text, became a folk name for the very real Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures whose physical legacy was everywhere. The link was not one of factual history, but of cultural continuity. The manuscript was a bridge of memory. It showed that even the most fantastical medieval compilations could contain kernels of deep time truth, preserving the echo of a real past in the language of myth. The stones of Newgrange, or Brú na Bóinne as it is called in the old tales, gave a home to the legend, proving that a story does not need to be literally true to be fundamentally about something real. The human need to explain the monumental works of those who walked the same land in a forgotten age. A chronicle's worth is measured by the ruins it can resurrect. In the quiet of a Mesopotamian monastery, an anonymous monk of Zucknin, writing in the Syriac language, compiled a sweeping history of the world in the 8th century. His work, The Chronicle of Zucknin, is a vast tapestry weaving biblical history with the tumultuous events of his own time, including the rise of Islam. Within its pages lies a remarkably detailed portrait of a specific city, Resafa, known to the Romans as Sergiopolis. The chronicler describes it not as a mythical place, but as a thriving pilgrimage center, a fortress of faith in the Syrian desert, renowned for its magnificent churches dedicated to Saint Sergius and its formidable, towering walls that defied the harsh landscape. For generations of scholars reading the text in distant libraries, this Resafa was a historical footnote, a name attached to a saint's cult, its grandeur perhaps exaggerated by the pious chronicler. The Syrian desert was seen as a barren expanse, not the home of a major urban center. The account was valued for its religious context, but its geographical and architectural specifics were often viewed with a degree of skepticism, another layer of pious description in a medieval text. The truth, however, was not hidden in parchment, but standing in silent, windswept majesty in the desert east of Aleppo. The site of Resafa, known today as Rusafa, is one of the most breathtaking and well-preserved archaeological complexes in the region. When explorers and later archaeologists arrived, they found a city that matched the chronicles' description with stunning fidelity. The massive, honey-colored limestone walls, studded with imposing square towers, still encircle the city exactly as described, a defensive circuit so impressive it continued to be maintained into the early Islamic period. Within those walls, the ruins of great basilicas emerged, including the monumental church of St. Sergius, its grand nave and apses clearly outlined against the sky. The chronicles' focus on pilgrimage was validated by the discovery of extensive underground cisterns and reservoirs, a vital infrastructure for hosting thousands of faithful in a waterless land, and by the remains of hostels and courtyards designed for visitors. The archaeology revealed a city that was not a minor outpost, but a crucial hub, flourishing first as a Roman and Byzantine pilgrimage destination, then seamlessly transitioning into an important early Islamic administrative center, with a mosque built respectfully alongside the Christian churches. The validation of Resafa through its ruins did more than confirm a chronicler's accuracy. It illuminated a pivotal moment in history, the physical coexistence of church and mosque within the same fortified walls gave tangible proof to the chronicle's narrative of continuity, showing how a sacred landscape could be revered across changing faiths. The stones of Resafa gave solid form to the chronicler's words, transforming his devotional account into a precise architectural and social blueprint. It stands as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most reliable historical witness is not the one who writes for posterity, but the one who simply records the shape of the world as it truly exists around him, leaving for us a key to a city that would otherwise be just a name in the sand. A collection of papers in a Tokyo archive held a different kind of map, one drawn in the 20th century to recover the first. The Hyogo Prefecture Kozui Otani documents are not ancient manuscripts, but the meticulous field reports of a series of Japanese expeditions led by Count Kozui Otani in the early 1900s. Their mission was audacious, to trace the lost footsteps of Buddhist monks along the Silk Road through the deserts of Central Asia. The reports themselves are modern, typed pages and photographs, yet they function as a crucial bridge containing copies, sketches, and first-hand descriptions of frescoes, texts, and cave complexes that were, even then, crumbling into oblivion. For decades, these documents were studied primarily by art historians as a record of a bygone exploration, their geographical data seen as interesting but secondary to the artistic analysis. The sites they described, like the Mogao Caves at Dunhuang, were known in legend, but their full scale and connection to the broader tapestry of Silk Road commerce remained partially obscured by the desert sands. The Otani reports, however, provided something invaluable: precise coordinates and detailed layouts from a time before widespread looting and natural decay had taken a greater toll. They acted as a forensic guide for later, more systematic archaeological work. When scholars returned to these regions with the reports in hand, they were not searching blindly. The Japanese expedition's notes led them directly to cave temples whose walls were covered not just with Buddhist imagery, but with vibrant portraits of Silk Road merchants, depictions of caravan life, and maps of trade routes that stretched from China to the Mediterranean. The physical validation was staggering. The caves contained real libraries like the famous Dunhuang Library Cave, stuffed with thousands of manuscripts in a dozen languages, from Buddhist sutras to Zoroastrian prayers, from merchant contracts to star charts. These were the tangible records of the very routes that had been mentioned in passing in Chinese dynastic histories, Persian travelogues, and even in the cryptic pages of the Periplus. The Otani collection, a modern archive, had helped unlock an ancient network. It proved that the legendary Silk Road was not a single path, but a pulsating web of cultural exchange, and that the sites facilitating this exchange were not mythical caravanserais, but real, complex communities whose walls still held their stories. The validation here was multi-layered, a 20th century document confirming the location of ancient sites, which in turn confirmed the reality of a trade network that had once been considered only a romantic idea. It showed that sometimes the key to the distant past is not an ancient scroll, but the careful notebook of a more recent seeker, preserving a snapshot of a vanishing world just in time for us to find it again. A fragile papyrus from the dusty storerooms of an Italian museum holds a list of names that once seemed to stretch into pure fantasy. Known as the Turin King List, this document from the time of Ramesses II painstakingly catalogues every ruler of Egypt, not just from recent memory, but reaching back across centuries into a shadowy, divine past. Its early entries transition from historical pharaohs into gods and demigods, figures like Horus and Thoth, who were said to have reigned for thousands of years before the first mortal king. To the Egyptologists who first pieced its fragments together, this was clearly a work of theological propaganda, a legitimizing document created to connect the living pharaoh to an unbroken, celestial lineage. The specific names and reigns of the earliest dynasties, those that followed the gods, were viewed with deep skepticism, seen as a mixture of half-remembered legend and political invention, a mythic prelude to the real history that began with the Grand Pyramids. The list was a fascinating curiosity, but its ancient beginning was not a reliable map. This skepticism began to dissolve in the dry, meticulous work of digging in the sands of Abydos and Saqqara. Archaeologists excavating the vast burial grounds of Egypt's earliest kings started to uncover small, unassuming artifacts, seal impressions, and ivory tags, inscribed with the names of rulers. These were not monumental inscriptions but administrative labels used to mark goods and documents in the royal household. One by one, these tiny, forgotten seals began to whisper the same names recorded on the Turin papyrus. A seal bearing the name of a pharaoh like Narmer or Den, once thought to be semi-legendary founders, was found in a tomb context that dated exactly to the period the king list assigned them. The sequence of rulers, as painstakingly ordered on the papyrus, began to find echoes in the stratigraphy of the cemeteries, with tombs of earlier kings lying beneath those of later ones, just as the list implied. Even more obscure names from the fragmentary sections of the list, pharaohs who had left no great monuments, were suddenly validated by a single seal or a mention in a nearby tomb inscription. The correlation was too precise to be chance. The Turin King List was not mere myth-making, it was a scholarly compilation, an attempt by Ramesside historians to archive a genuine, if imperfectly understood, royal chronology that stretched back to the very dawn of their state. Its inclusion of gods was a cultural statement of origin, but its listing of mortal kings proved to be a remarkably accurate historical framework. This validation transformed a theological text into a crucial piece of forensic evidence. It provided the backbone, the sequence into which new archaeological discoveries could be slotted, turning isolated tombs and seals into chapters of a confirmed narrative. The list became the guidebook, and the buried seals became the proof, working in tandem to pull the earliest dynasties out of the realm of legend and into the clear light of history. It demonstrated that even a document filled with gods and impossibly long reigns could still serve as a sober, invaluable record, a bridge of names across a void of time. A hero's quest for a golden fleece once sailed on the edge of the known world. The Argonautica, an epic poem by Apollonius Rhodius written in the 3rd century before the Common Era, recounts the voyage of Jason and his crew of heroes, the Argonauts. Their destination was a place of almost mythical remoteness, the kingdom of Colchis, a land at the far eastern shore of the Black Sea, ruled by a powerful king. The prize was the golden fleece, the skin of a magical ram, hung in a sacred grove and guarded by a dragon. For centuries, this narrative was the quintessential adventure story, a beautiful tapestry of gods, monsters, and impossible tasks. Scholars admired its literary craft but placed Colchis firmly in the realm of poetic geography, a fantastical setting invented to represent the ultimate edge of civilization, a place of otherness where magic still held sway. The detailed descriptions of its wealth, its skilled metalworkers, and its formidable king were seen as classic tropes of epic, not a report on a real culture. The kingdom was a necessary fiction, the distant, glittering backdrop for a hero's trial. This interpretation held until the mountains and coastal plains of modern Georgia began to yield their secrets. Archaeologists working in the region, particularly in the rich Colchian lowlands, started to uncover evidence of a sophisticated and wealthy Bronze Age and Iron Age culture that flourished exactly where the ancient Greeks had placed the legendary kingdom. The findings were astonishing. They revealed a society with advanced metallurgy, producing exquisite gold work of breathtaking artistry. Elaborate gold jewelry, diadems, and ceremonial vessels were found in burial mounds, speaking of an elite class that controlled vast resources. This was not a poor backwater. It was a center of technological innovation and trade, sitting astride routes that brought precious metals down from the Caucasus Mountains. The material culture matched the poem's emphasis on Colchian skill and wealth with uncanny precision. The legendary golden fleece itself found a plausible origin in local practice. Historical accounts from the region describe a method of panning for gold in mountain streams using sheepskins. Miners would place a fleece in the water, and the gold particles would catch in the wool. The fleece, heavy with gold dust, would then be hung to dry, literally becoming a golden fleece. This practical technology, transforming a mundane tool into a symbol of immense wealth, perfectly explained the core object of the myth. The poem's setting was not invented, it was observed, perhaps through the reports of early Greek traders venturing into the Black Sea. The Argonautica, therefore, performs a fascinating alchemy. It takes the very real, impressive culture of Colchis with its gold and its technical prowess, and weaves it into a heroic narrative, amplifying its distance and mystery for poetic effect. The validation through archaeology does not mean a dragon guarded the fleece, but it confirms that the kingdom Jason sought was a real, powerful, and dazzling place. A land whose real wealth was so remarkable it could only be explained in the language of legend. A hero's fleece might gleam with gold, but a king's hall holds a different kind of power, woven from memory and stone. Our final manuscript is not a single book, but a collection of tales that form the bedrock of Welsh mythology, the Mabinogion. Within its pages, the courts of legendary kings come alive, places like Arbeth, where strange enchantments unfold, and Harlech, whose sea-washed towers are the stage for epic rivalries and tragedy. For generations, readers outside Wales absorbed these stories as pure Celtic fantasy, a beautiful but entirely fictional landscape of heroic princes, shape-shifting magicians, and otherworldly castles. The geography seemed symbolic, a map of the imagination rather than a record of any real terrain. The mighty fortresses described as centers of power were assumed to be as mythical as the characters who ruled them, poetic settings for a nation's dream of its own past. Yet the rugged hills of Wales themselves held a different story, written not on parchment but in the contours of the land. Archaeologists surveying the Welsh countryside began to note a striking pattern. The locations named in the Mabinogion, often still bearing the same or similar names today, were frequently crowned by the substantial, weathered remains of Iron Age hill forts. These were not minor enclosures but formidable strongholds, with multiple concentric ramparts of earth and stone encircling the crests of strategic hills. At a site like Castle Bryn Gwyn on Anglesey, The massive circular earthworks spoke of a place of immense communal effort and regional significance, a power center that dominated the local landscape for centuries. Similarly, the imposing fort at Pen Dinas near Aberystwyth, with its complex gateways and commanding views over land and sea, fit the description of a seat of authority exactly like the Harlech of legend. The correlation was too consistent to ignore. The storytellers of the Mabinogion were not inventing geography. They were anchoring their narratives to the most prominent or inspiring ancient monuments in their world. The so-called mythical courts were, in fact, the remembered ruins of a very real past. These Iron Age citadels, abandoned for 1,000 years by the time the tales were written down, still loomed large in the cultural consciousness. Their silent, grassy ramparts became the natural stages for stories of kingship, conflict, and magic, their physical presence giving weight and place to the floating world of legend. This validation completes a profound circle. It shows that myth often begins not with invention, but with observation, with a people looking at the oldest things in their landscape and asking, who built this and what mighty deeds happened here? The Mabinogion does not record the history of the Iron Age, but it preserves its echo, transforming the empty hill forts back into populated courts of power, their stones once again ringing with the voices of heroes. It is a fitting final testament to the pattern we have seen 35 times over, that the line between myth and history is often just a matter of waiting for the land itself to speak and confirm what the stories have been whispering all along. 35 manuscripts, each once labeled a fantasy, now stand as verified landmarks on our map of the past. When we step back from these individual discoveries, a powerful and consistent pattern emerges, revealing why these texts were so easily dismissed and what ultimately brought them back into the light of history. The reasons for their initial rejection often fell into three broad categories. First was the presence of exaggeration and miraculous elements, tales of gods walking among mortals, of heroes performing superhuman feats, or of cities roofed in gold seemed like the clear markers of fiction, not factual reporting. Second was a perceived lack of corroborating evidence. If no other known civilization mentioned the Hittites, or if no ruins matched the description of Troy, then the text was deemed unreliable, a classic case of an absence of evidence being mistaken for evidence of absence. And third, there was often a deep cultural or temporal bias. Scholars from one tradition might dismiss the historical claims of another as primitive myth-making, or modern thinkers might assume ancient people were incapable of accurate long-distance travel or precise astronomical observation. Yet in every case, a key turned the lock. That key was almost always a form of tangible, physical evidence that existed independently of the text itself. Archaeology provided the most dramatic validations, unearthing the very walls, tombs, and streets that the manuscripts described. Geology and satellite imagery revealed lost riverbeds and submerged cities, proving that landscapes change in ways that can make ancient accounts seem impossible. The patient decipherment of forgotten scripts, from Maya hieroglyphs to Hittite cuneiform, gave voice to the civilizations in question, allowing them to confirm their own existence and sometimes even reference the very events recorded about them. And in several instances, it was cross-referencing with other, already verified sources that built a web of credibility, where a name in a Roman trade log matched a description in a Tamil epic, or a king list on papyrus aligned with seals found in a tomb. The overarching lesson here is not that we should believe every ancient tale literally. Healthy skepticism is the bedrock of good history. The lesson is about the peril of automatic dismissal. It is a call for a more nuanced balance, a posture of informed open-mindedness. We must learn to read these ancient sources not as either pure fact or pure fiction, but as complex documents that often contain multiple layers of truth. A story can be mythologized, its heroes amplified, and its events streamlined for poetic effect, while still being anchored to a real place, a real conflict, or a real cultural memory. The miraculous elements might be the narrative packaging, but the geographical and cultural details within can be startlingly precise. For historians and for the curious public alike, this pattern suggests a humbling principle. When an ancient source describes something that seems impossible, our first question should not be, why would they make this up? But rather, what could they have been describing? What real-world phenomenon, now lost or misunderstood, could have inspired this account? The journey of these 35 manuscripts from myth to history is a testament to the patience of discovery and the resilience of truth. It reminds us that the past often speaks in a language we have forgotten how to hear, and that the most incredible stories are sometimes waiting, not for a debunker, but for a decoder. This pattern of rediscovery offers more than a list of corrected errors. It paints a portrait of history itself. Our understanding of the past is not a static monument, but a living narrative, a story we are constantly rewriting as new evidence emerges from the earth, the sea, and the forgotten corners of ancient libraries. These 35 manuscripts, once dismissed, now stand as vital bridges. They connect the world of story, where meaning and memory are shaped, to the world of stone and soil, where events left their physical mark. They teach us that myth and history are not opposites, but often collaborators in the human effort to remember. One gives us the facts, the other gives us the meaning, and only together can we glimpse the full picture of who we were. This ongoing dialogue between text and artifact urges a profound humility. It asks us to reconsider every other so-called lost account, every legend relegated to the shelf of fantasy. What other grand narratives from our collective past are we currently mislabeling? What descriptions in crumbling codices or epic poems are waiting, right now, for a curious mind to look at them not as fiction, but as a faded map to a real place? The journey does not end here. It continues with every new excavation, every deciphered symbol, and with your own curiosity. Look at the ancient stories from your own heritage or from cultures that fascinate you. Read them again, but this time ask the question these discoveries have taught us to ask. Not is this true, but what truth might this be preserving? The next great discovery, the next bridge between myth and reality, might just begin with a story you choose to believe in, just enough to go looking.